Okay, we will now discuss in turn each of these papers, and if I have the schedule right, we'll have paper number 5, Joe's paper, will be discussed by Partha and by Liu Jian, whose remarks I will be reading. As many of you know, Professor Liu was not able to get here, but was very kind to send in remarks on both this paper and on Barnali's paper. So I could begin, unless you, okay. I'm sure we'll get you a copy of this, Joe, so I will not read in its entirety. He has a few areas where it looks like typos or spellings of certain Chinese names need to be corrected, but I won't read those. But he begins with the following. Academically speaking, this is just an excellent paper. India-China border dispute has been a major issue affecting mutual political trust and further development of the political relations between India and China, two giant countries in both Asia and the world. Many papers and books have been published on this subject, yet this paper has impressed me with its clear-cut viewpoints, strong supporting argument, and meticulous logic. I really appreciate the author's just and objective stance while tracing the origin and discussing the evolution of this knotty issue, and he has made the reality of this issue more clear. I find in him a promising and a great scholar in the area of India-China relations. I've heard Professor Liu comment on many papers before, and I note this is not something, he doesn't commonly hand out such compliments, so it's really a tribute. However, this paper can be further strengthened, okay? I noticed that the author has made use of some materials from the Chinese side, mainly cited from some well-known English works. At page 6, in indirect speech regarding he's going to tell me later how to pronounce it, Huang Dajin, it's map from an agreed frontier by Parshotram Mehra, 1992, and in the footnote number 11, the name of the Chinese diplomat is incorrect. His name is not Huang Daqing or Huang Daren. Daqing means great Qing, as in the dynasty. Daren means great man or superior official, and in the Qing dynasty, common people and lower ranking officials addressed superior officials as Daren instead of calling them their names to show respect. Foreigners who came to China were also demanded to address them as Daren, a kind of ridiculous self-arrogance, hence the confusion of the name. His real name is Hongjun in Pinyin. Moreover, the map under his name, in fact, was a map on Russia-China boundaries made by Russians when he purchased while he was serving as ambassador to Moscow. Only Professor Liu would be able to have these details in command. He, that is Hongjun, collated and reprinted the map in Russian, which he did not know. He did not know Russian language. He made some minor changes, and some frontier outposts in the Pamir area were moved into Russia's territories by mistake. The newly printed map was shown to a Russian minister in Beijing, and he immediately snatched it as a treasure. As a result, Hongjun was impeached and fell ill and died shortly thereafter. Therefore, it seems better to avoid using this map in his name as evidence. That sounds like a whole other paper. Speaking of strange and bizarre, yes, we have a strange and fantastic story about a map. Okay, then a couple of points on like I said, I won't go over about the just spellings of Chinese names. He says that the italic quotation under the wide heaven there is no land that is not the emperor's at page 23 in your paper has a flaw. The book of poetry was finally edited by Confucius. At that time the word Huangdi was not even created, and the original term is Wang or king. Some other translation perhaps can be taken for reference, and he provides you with the translation that I won't read. At page 26 of the paper, the author mentions that quote, there were periods when the Nepalese armies occupied the Chinese capital. The quotation from Prime Minister Nehru, it says a quotation from Prime Minister Nehru on Sino-Indian relations. Professor Liu, speaking to you, says, please check that again. It was Tibetan armies that occupied the Chinese capital, Chang'an, briefly. for 15 days in November 764, not the Nepali armies. Also check the fact about the armed offensive of Zhao Arfeng on page 15 and 16. Zhao Arfeng in Pinyin was a very important, Zhao Arfeng in Pinyin, very important Chinese official stationed in Tibet. He erected some boundary tablets in the border area. Could his action in Tibet be considered as an armed offensive? Question mark. That's Professor Leo asking you. Just use of the word armed offensive. I will skip the next remark, and then he provides some sources for you to use. Chinese scholars have written quite a number of books and papers on the India-China border dispute. Some are available in English. He gives you a citation for Wang Hongwei and Xuecheng Liu. And then says there's a professor at Yunnan University, Yu Jiaoyi, who has written a number of influential papers concerning the China-India traditional and customary boundary in history. Nearly all these papers by Chinese scholars are in Chinese, and I've heard him say this before, that if you wish to continue your studies on the subject, you have a lot to do and you can achieve a lot, and I'm sure that you, Joe, can make theoretical contributions to the earlier solution of the border dispute between China and India. Joe has become influential in China now. Liu Jin's last advice for him is study some Chinese, and you will be able to make use of the first-hand Chinese materials and understand Chinese scholars' writings directly. Thus, you will not be far from greatness as a scholar. I really appreciated your paper. Who wants to follow those? Okay, Partha.
Good. I'm not going to follow that.
Microphone. We need to, because we are recording. Everybody has to speak.
The microphone. Thank you. Okay, Joe. So after that, you don't really need any further comments, right? Let me therefore do something that is. So three things that I sort of get from your paper, and you can tell me whether I'm reading the right thing. The first is, and it's a way of structuring the paper, whether which you may want to consider. So one issue, one way that you sort of put forward the story is one of traditional customary claims in contrast to imperial claims. And the question, therefore, is at various points in time, who is the imperialist, whether it's obviously in this case the British, but then Nehru sort of goes on to talk about whether or not the Chinese state became the Chinese state without any degree of imperialism, right? So that's one framing, and I think you do a pretty nice job of, to the extent, and this is subject to that, to the extent of the kinds of diversity of sources that you provide, of essentially showing that the understanding of what is the traditional customary claim is not unique and has fair degree of variation, right? That's the first thing. The second is, and this is a more interesting from a strategic point of view, is that your reading of the sources seems to indicate that in the Western sector, the Chinese versions of whatever the customary claims are not very different from Indian claims in that sector. And it varies occasionally, of course, when the sort of map after the war comes in, that's obviously not, when talking about sort of slicing the Pangong Lake at its widest point and so on, that's not where the Indian structure comes through. But there's there are a number of Chinese sources which seem to be not too far from where the Indian story is. Of course, not to the full extent of the Aksai Chin, but substantively. On the other hand, in the East, there seems to be, as you said, a fair degree of similar amounts of sources, which seems to indicate that if not Arunachal, Tawang at least seems to be quite clearly outside British influence and very much in sort of Tibetan control. And therefore, to the extent to which that translates into Chinese suzerainty and sovereignty, because that's where the transition is taking place, there is more of a sort of, according to your sources, credibility to Chinese claims in the eastern sector. However, this documentary evidence of credibility is exactly the opposite to what the control of territory is. And the control of territory, as you know, in the, you mentioned the 62 communication from Zhao Enlai, which basically says, you know, let's begin by looking at control of territory and not worry too much about anything else. So here is this interesting situation where you have a structure where the actual control of territory is sort of different from what sort of normatively established claims can be, and that would be the kind of negotiation that then can come through could be important. So given this context, then the question that you do not ask, and I think you might want to ask, is what is it that sustains these narratives in these two nations? So why is it India sort of chooses to have this narrative that it currently has, and why is it that China wishes to have a narrative that it currently has? What kinds of forces, structures, that seems to be, so given that I think as you establish relatively well that the border itself is a pretty fuzzy kind of story, what is it that establishes the rigidity of the claims in relationship to the fuzziness of the reality, so to speak, right? In that sense, the illusion, the hard illusion and the soft reality sort of is what the structure is. And trying to explain that might be an interesting thing to do. Thanks.
Okay. Fulon, do you have anything to add at this point, or wait till this?
Oh, there, right next to you.
You're okay. Yes, of course. Young Liu's next. Thank you. Yeah, please.
Microphone. That one, this one?
This one doesn't work.
This one doesn't work, okay? Off it goes.
First, I would like to say that, so just like Joey mentioned at the beginning, history is very important, and new findings are in the history. So we'll create new discourses, create new narrative, and subvert the old narratives. And in the case of India-China relations, and in the case of border dispute, so I think your research is very important to reverse. So if you go deeper, it's to reverse the old. To subvert the old narrative. So this is, I would like to emphasize the significance of this paper. And first, you focus mainly on the border making process in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and applies constructivist theory in the analysis. And the boundary making process was set in the context of the great game between the British and between Britain and Russia, and has to be understood in the normative expectations of the Western and the Chinese on interstate relations at that time. And the Western understanding was territorial state, of which fixing boundaries was a crucial part, and Chinese understanding was based on a universal empire that was social rather than limited by the lands. And the methods, it's qualitative and comparative historical analysis. So here you have so nicely showed the comparison of the eastern part and the western eastern sector, the evolutions of boundaries in western sectors, and the evolutions of boundary in east sectors. And in here in the Western sectors, the comparison was done well, especially on Chinese representations of the boundaries. You lists 5 Chinese cartographic evidence before the 1962 war, showing that Chinese representation of boundary was closer to the McDonald line, which is along the middle of Aksai Chin Plateau rather than Chinese claimed line today, which is western of the Aksai Chin. And here it's but here, if you go further, that can in this sector, you can explain why China choose the currently claimed line, because this is your arguments. But if you can in this section explain more on why Chinese choose the line the line eastern to the the line western to the McDonald line is its claimed line, and the problems and the comparison in the west in the eastern sectors it's quite weak. It is mainly a historical presentation of the events around a similar conference in 1914s. And I think this section could be better structured by separating India's part and China's part, and by adding subheadings listing different positions so that the reader can better understand the differences between India's and China's approaches in these sectors. And I also like to raise your attention on the different approach of India and China, so in the eastern sector and in the western sector. So here in your argument, the starting point is that India and China claimed boundaries, each country claimed boundary is traditional, customary boundaries. But I think in the eastern, in the western sector, China's approach, it's a traditional customary boundary, but in the western, in the western it's a traditional customary boundary, but in the eastern sector it's more imperial boundaries, which is mentioned by Partha. And it's in Chinese discourse, it's the boundary, it's imposed by the imperialist countries. So here, I would like to so in the eastern sectors, it needs really to arrange your arguments better and listed the positions of India and China. And here, one suggestion for the further editorial things on this paper, that it's your reorganization of the citations. There are many long citations in the manuscript. Sometimes it's for reader very confusing where your arguments ends and where citation starts. It would be very helpful to start with a new paragraph when citation come and change the fonts to highlight such citations, thus distinguish them from the author's own writing. And so here, I quite agree that there's no clear understanding today on the border claims that was in 1962. This is what you argued. And cited in the paper, a statement of Nehru, history is full of changes, full of ups and downs, and full of all kinds of things, and full of mixture of people and countries. And the politician of that time did understand the essence of the boundary questions, yet the real-world political process was much more complex, and rhetorics and compromise was essential parts of the decision-making. I believe today the politicians in India and China, to a great extent, have similar understanding of the politicians of the wartime, yet understanding is one issue and the political practice is another issue. So on the whole, the paper has lots of promise because it chooses a constructivist perspective of looking at boundary questions and appearing for changing the academic premises of understanding boundaries. However, it needs to be edited in style and restructured of your arguments to make the comparison more clear. At the end, I will ask you 2 questions. One, yeah, okay, just like to ask what is new, because there is lots of writings in these issues, and what you want to bring new things and comparing to the old sources. And the second is, how did you collect your sources? What kind of sources? How do you go to library, or what kinds of method you use when you collect your sources for these cartographs? Thank you very much.
Okay, next we'll turn to comments on Yuan Zhang's paper, beginning with Rebecca Fu. Oh, Fu Long, I'm sorry. Yes, your turn. All right.
Okay, Ashok asked me to comment on this paper, but it's a very difficult task for me, because in this room, if you want to find someone who has absolutely no knowledge of the subject, it's me. I'm an urban study specialist. When reading this paper, because I can't give you a verdict or suggestions, and if I do, don't listen to me, because this is not the expert view, expert opinion. When I start reading this paper, I immediately feel captured, because you are trying to apply constructive theory, some theory, maybe I don't know there, so probably need a better quotation, the limitation and the strength of that theory. And also you touch upon the issue of boundary, and there might be a lot of study of boundary from the human geography or other discipline, but then I realized that your interest is really not in the constructive theory, boundary issues, in a generic term. You are more interested in Indian-China borders. So I think that's fine. And then you present a lot of historical materials. I would suggest you would distinguish 2 types of narratives. One is reading of history, so the dispute, the historical events, activities, and then you have another aspect, basically is comparing evidence, comparing texts. So basically you read theory, read history and read the text. And currently these 2 themes are densely together. So maybe at some stage you could distinguish them, the 2 lines, into 2 sections. I don't know, but this is purely from the social science perspective rather than arts and humanity perspective. Okay.
Thank you very much, Fu Long. Okay, now we'll turn to Yuan Zhang's paper and begin with Rebecca Fu.
First, I want to express my gratitude to the to ICI and the organizers of this symposium. Well, this invitation came unexpectedly in the middle of my messy pre-defense stage. And reading this paper, the paper by Zhang Yuan, refreshed me. This study broadened my knowledge of the representation of animals in the Buddhist tradition, as well as in early Chinese materials. The only image of animal that I studied in is the peacock. In a coming publication, I examined the Tibetan Buddhist and the pharmaceutical provenance of the image of the peacock's gallbladder, considered as a lethal poison in contemporary Chinese culture. Well, now, turning back to Dr. Zhang Yuan's paper. First, I want to say the 13-page collation is especially impressive and thorough. I enjoyed reading this collation from Sanskrit, though my Sanskrit is rotten, the English translation to the 3 Chinese versions. I read everything word by word. Since this paper centers on animals, I paid special attention to entries where the Chinese versions mention an animal, but the original, if I can say original, the original Sanskrit source doesn't, such as A53 on page 14, is his nose bridge is high and straight like the parrot, and entry M23 on page 8, hiding his genital as a horse does. Finding out such interesting points is fun, but meanwhile, I couldn't help but wonder, would the potential readers of the proposed edited volume, who possibly or probably don't read Chinese, notice these variances and recognized the significance of Dr. Zhang Yuan's work? Maybe providing English translation for the Chinese versions would solve this problem. I guess many readers will be curious about what the Chinese characters, the Chinese words say. The second point is I propose that it would be great to make slight adjustments to the relative weight of some parts in Dr. Zhang Yuan in your paper, like part 3, the 13-page collation, and part 2, the 4-page part 2, from which your major strength, your major argument develops. So maybe how about further expanding part 4, continuing beyond the questions of cultural differences and similarities to engage with more meaningful issues. I believe you have many good ideas, but you didn't have time. So I don't have an idea. I don't have any idea of what kind of question issues are more meaningful. And maybe I don't know the purpose of this edited volume. I don't know the editor's preference. How about maybe I propose that how about moving the 13-page collation, almost half of the size of the paper, after the main text as a appendix or supplementary text. Maybe, I'm not sure. The third point is recently we have witnessed the publication of a great number of scholarship on animals, especially in the Buddhist tradition and also in Chinese culture. I think it would be great to incorporate some of these studies to flesh out your bibliography. For example, Professor Chen Huaiyu at University, Associate Professor at University of Arizona State University, and he published. This book is in Chinese. The 动物与中国政治秩序 Animals in Medieval Chinese Political and Religious Order from Shanghai Guji in 2012. I know this study centers on medieval China. It's not your period, but I like the very rich bibliography in Dr. Chen's work. So especially a lot of them are by Western scholars. So, okay. Well, it's time to conclude my comments. It's an interesting topic, and I enjoy reading your paper, and I'm looking forward to the publication. I'm looking forward to reading a further revised version of your paper in the proposed volume. And the last thing that I want to say is, I'm more than happy to share with you after this conference my experience of publishing papers in English as a Chinese speaker.
Thank you very much. Okay, next we'll hear from Pasang Sherpa, and then Aman will be the third.
Okay. Thank you very much for the paper. This is very exciting and a lot of amazing information. I'm a cultural anthropologist myself who studies Nepal and Sherpa and environment, so this is completely new and different to me. However, I think this is an interesting paper. I have a few quick comments. First of all, I'm very curious about the methodological innovation that you talk about in your paper.
Yeah, lean into the mic.
Okay. Yeah, so as soon as I started reading your paper, I was very fascinated by the part where, in the introduction, where you talk about methodological innovation. I don't know anything about I don't use philology or culturology. I do ethnography. So, so if you want to give some descriptions about what these methods are from your perspective, I think for a reader like myself who does not come from this background, it would be very beneficial. The article attempts to figure out the intrinsic cultural characteristics, identifying auspicious animals and elements, and I think that's one of the biggest strengths of your paper. Particularly, so the article itself is also well structured and detailed. The textual comparison and the analysis are completely fascinating to me, again, as an anthropologist. And particularly interesting is the creation of this Buddha image that is superhuman or more than human or not even like human, you know. So there are so many different kinds of images that are being created here. And I think continuing that part of your paper, in your conclusion, you, however, talk about the universality of the Buddha that surpasses culture, race, and nationality. I like that, but at the same time, I'm wondering if the evidence that you provide in your paper is sufficient to make such a statement. I think at this point, the evidence actually instead shows, firstly, what are locally special or what was locally special at the time, i.e. the auspicious elements and animals, which you already talk about. And secondly, I think your evidence shows how these various special items and entities and beings are inserted into the portrayal as well as the creation of Buddha image. And I think that's the strength of your paper. And I would actually love to see you highlight that part of your paper and bring that to the front instead of going through this various 4 different kinds of conclusion, which is fine. But I think it's kind of shadowing what is really strong about your paper. In the conclusion, you also talk about the differences between Pu and Feng. And as a reader, I'm curious to know what these differences are. I think that needs more explanation and more description. From an editorial perspective, I would just ask you to spend some time discussing the differences and perhaps introducing more information before conclusion and not necessarily in the conclusion itself. So that's basically what I have for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Aman?
Yeah, thank you. That like the song is not at all familiar with a lot of the
Can you move closer to the mic? Or, yeah.
technical.
It may be off, indeed. Yeah, it still needs to be turned on. I see.
It's a very loud song. Well, let's say on off to the technical. Good.
Check, check, check.
Thank you.
Thanks. Let me make a couple of sort of substantive points and then maybe identify a few of your claims that I was hoping to get more on. I was very interested in the sort of question of how religious traditions are transformed as they travel from sort of one particular setting to a new one. And I mean, of course, there's sort of particular ways to understand the ways these transformations take place. You know, there's this idea of syncretism, which has been, of course, largely debunked as being sort of pejorative to sort of new religious forms. So I was wondering, since you have sort of this very rich material on the representation of the Buddha, and you also mentioned that there's a similarity in the logic and mentality of such representations in both the Indian and Chinese contexts. So I was hoping to sort of hear more on this sort of question of transformation. I think it again raises this question of mixing versus, what exactly is new about these forms, and how locating religion in a different context changes also its rationality and its focuses and so forth. The second point was about the body. Of course, everyone will notice that there's the most of the marks, related to animals, but also sort of looking at how the physical characteristics and qualities of Buddha's figure might also relate to some kind of moral, ethical dimensions as well. That, religion not as just a sort of system of belief, but also sort of cultivating the body and bodily qualities as a way of sort of cultivating at the same time, moral, ethical perspectives or qualities as well. So if, that potentially an area of looking at of this sort of embodied perspective. Then a couple of claims that you made that I didn't get much evidence of. First, the claim about how certain elements of the Buddha's body sort of challenge the caste system. I was hoping if you could actually give more sort of evidence on how exactly. I wasn't, of course, familiar with some of the technical terms there, so maybe that's why I was lost. And also, I guess Rebecca already pointed out about the translations. I don't read any of the Chinese languages or Sanskrit. Again, I was wondering how the different translations, represent different kinds of transformations within the Buddhist tradition as it sort of develops in China. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Aman. Now we have comments on the seventh paper, Barnali Chanda's paper. Also, Professor Liu will make an appearance. Hassan and Marina will speak. Does any of you want to go first?
Would you like to go first? Or?
Sure, we haven't heard from you yet. No, but go. Please. You have a mic?
I was hoping to be last. Well, Barnali, thank you very much for a very interesting paper, and I really enjoyed reading it because I've always liked Chinese strange stories. Until recently, I didn't know that that's a separate genre of literature in Chinese, and I did some research just to make sure that I'm on the same page. And this sort of brings up my first comment, and I have very few. But my first comment to you is that it seems that there is a little bit of a slippage. You talk about, and you start the presentation and the paper with the intention to define the strange. But then throughout the paper and throughout the presentation, you move from the concept of the strange to the genre of the strange. And to me, these are maybe not necessarily the same things. If you want to say that they're the same things, you have to be very explicit about it, because to me, the concept of the strange in itself might be something completely different from an entire genre of literature. The other thing, and maybe this is my politics background, I'm really curious for you to highlight more sort of the function of the genre of the strange in Chinese literature as what you seem to call it a form of resistance, resistance to the Confucius orthodoxy, let's say. I'm not quite sure that this is the case, if this is really the case. I know that the literature of the strange was perhaps forbidden at times, or it was not officially endorsed, but we all know that most of the writings of the literature of the strange appeared from Chinese, the board Confucian scholars, and basically everybody was reading it. And also it was written in a different language. It was written in the vernacular. So to me, I want to find out more whether this was a resistance, subversion of the ideology, or just a parallel universe kind of reserved for those who want to experience wonder and amazement of some sort. Two more comments, sort of building on that. I think you need to find a way, and I was trying to see if I can pull it off from your presentation better, because I couldn't sense it from the paper. You talk a lot about the audience's reaction. You talk about affect. You talk about amusement, wonder, and unless a person is very familiar with the texts, it's very difficult to translate that affect for the reader. So I don't know why somebody's amazed or wonders or whatever else happens there. So I couldn't think of the best way for you to be doing this, but I'm pretty sure maybe if you're giving some quotes, more extensive quotes from the texts, it might appear. And the last thing, following up on Partha's comment on the long shadows, I was thinking, again, the literature of the strange is always fascinating. And of course, it made me think of Wu Chang'an and The Journey to the West, which is written later than the period that you're looking at, but supposedly covers that period. And perhaps we all know, maybe not all of us, know that Dragon Ball, the cartoon Japanese series, was created on the Dragon Ball, on the Journey to the West story. So what can you perhaps for your future work talk about how this literature of the strange, or how these concepts evolve and entertain and amuse people until today, the younger generations? All my undergraduate students know about Dragon Ball, so they're, yeah. So just the last comment is your presentation was wonderful. I would even say a much greater improvement on the paper, and I want to congratulate you on that. Good job.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
Hassan.
Well, another interesting paper to read, also not from my subject area, but very fascinating to me as an anthropologist, because everything cultural is interesting to me and very exciting, and everything seems to be cultural. So everything is interesting and fascinating in that sense. But coming back to
the mic.
Yes. Okay. So coming back to the paper, first of all, after I completed reading the paper, I was really wondering and very curious about why you chose to make this comparison between the Chinese and Indian narrative traditions, and also, like, what were your personal interest in this, and also what can we learn about these comparisons, and then why strange and fantastic? Why not simple and mundane? And I ask this question because I think if you mention all of this in your introduction, it makes the paper clearer, and your ideas and arguments clearer for a reader who doesn't know anything about the region or the topic. And in your paper, okay, I think this is just a technical issue, but that you have links to different notes, and there are different notes numbers, but the notes are missing, so that might just be a technical thing. But one way I think the paper can be improved would be to just having like a background or introduction part where you contextualize, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing, and this is what I think this topic is important, and this method is necessary. Secondly, I'm also curious about your methodology. Like, what are you doing, and how are you making these comparisons? So saying briefly or in detail what you're doing, I think that could really help. And in your conclusion part, you suddenly talk about the third world, the third narrative world. And I think that's very interesting and very fascinating, but I think that's also underdeveloped. It seems like the paper is building and it's developing, but then it ends. So I would be very interested in seeing how you develop this idea of third narrative world, and what do you mean by that? And how does your research, your investigation help us think about this third narrative world? And why not fourth and fifth narrative worlds? You know, you can go on and go forth. So those are my main comments. And I think other ones are just simple comments, which we can always talk about later. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Fulong,
Yeah,
you have
I
something to
also
say
read
too?
this
Great, okay.
paper. Again,
Oh.
again, don't listen to me. This is someone who have no knowledge, has no knowledge at all. But I will make a similar comment, I think relate to your comment as well. I wonder whether you would strengthen your methodology a little bit. I think every subject or discipline has its own rule, so play with your own rule. But I was wondering whether you would explicitly use some methodology. I think in your subject there might be comparative literature or whatever compared to text. There must be such kind of methodology about comparing to text. Yeah, how would you compare to text? I would say you in your analysis you have two aspects. One is you read the text. One is you read out of text. You mentioned that they are social functions. They help people escape from reality, or they may serve as a narrative to counter the orthodox discourse or whatever. So I think probably separate these two a bit. First is to compare by its text, and then go beyond comparing the text themselves. But again, don't listen to me. But I have a comment general to this session. I think this is a wonderful session, interesting, because you see the session is entitled Historical Narrative, a single thing. But to me, I think that there should be two things, is history and narratives. So you compare narrative and text, or narrative and maps, or whatever. So you compare them using a very defined methodology. People will recognize your, in terms of your source of data, evidence, methodology. So you compare, find the differences, then contextualize them into historical events, activities of politicians, the political economic background, the Indian society at that time, Chinese society at that time. They are border to the empire, so they are less governed. So things like there are no people actually live there, so it doesn't matter. So all this are outside these narratives, maybe, but just then so on.
Great, thanks for that observation. So I'll quickly go through Professor Liu's comments on Barnali's paper, and then we'll give each of the discussants a few minutes to reflect on, not address every question or comment, but to pick out a few points from the rich comments that you've received and raise those to the group. Okay, Professor Liu says, this is a very interesting paper covering a complicated literary phenomenon which has existed for 2,000 years or so in both India and China. It is a comparative study of the similarities and dissimilarities of the strange narrative tales, very influential not only in China and India, but also in the rest of the world. The author has expressed some fresh and impressive views of her own on this subject. With the introduction of Buddhism into China, Chinese literature, culture, world lookout, their conceptions of time and space, etc., had undergone much profound change. Without the influence of Indian literature, with Buddhism as the main vehicle, the Chinese literature would be quite different and could not be so rich and varied. Strange and fantastic tales have broadened Chinese vision of the world and other worlds and stimulated their curiosity and imagination. Yet this paper could be further polished and strengthened. For example, I won't go through every one of these, and again, we'll give you a copy. On page 1, the author cited some sayings by Confucius to illustrate Chinese attitudes towards this strange tale. This is a very interesting, I mean, setting this up, but you know, how you can interpret the same set of characters in completely opposite ways, because he notes that your, which you also showed on the slide, quote, the study of strange doctrines is injurious indeed, unquote. Professor Liu says, even Chinese scholars have different opinions on how to interpret this saying. Here, the quoted translation, your quoted translation, is not accepted by most Chinese scholars. The proper translation, according to Professor Liu anyway, should be as follows. A study of other doctrines can end the harm of becoming one-sided. That's a, obviously that's what I was getting at. Nearly opposite the kind of meaning that imputed to that same set of characters.
So it's both other and strange.
A study of other doctrines can end the harm of becoming one-sided. So this saying has not. So Professor Liu says this saying has nothing to do with strange tale, and you can take it out of the paper. At the same page, the author says Confucian silence regarding the supernatural is a validation for political censorship, unquote. He says, this also seems far from the fact, for at that time, even in China, there was nothing like political censorship. Confucius was a realist and disliked to talk about what he was unable to see or prove. As for your quote, in which you say in the paper, quote, in Confucian ideology dominated Chinese literary tradition, there was hardly any space for supernatural accounts, unquote. He says this was also not true. Confucian ideology was not the main reason for China's lack of supernatural accounts in ancient times. Chinese were more realistic and did not have very rich mythology even at the dawn of their history. Again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just reading this, but it picks up on I think what you were saying too. Chinese strange tales at the very beginning were just imitation or adaptation of their Indian counterparts scattered in various Buddhist sutras. Of course, Chinese elements, context, and details were gradually merged into the tales of Indian origin. Therefore, the strange tales in both India and China, especially in the first millennium AD, shared many common motifs and plots and animals. The author discussed, quote, the metamorphosis of man into beast or other creatures, and asserts that, quote, in Chinese stories, we can see the transformations are mostly irreversible. Once transformed, they can never go back to their original form, unquote. Professor Liu says, however, in a well-known Chinese novel entitled Journey to the West, Yuan Zhang was turned into a tiger by a demon, and he, after much suffering, went back to his original self again. The metamorphosis of man into beast or other creatures has become a tradition in Chinese literature down to modern times. For example, there are quite a few similar stories in something called Strange and Fantastic Tales by Pu Songling from 1640 to 1715. Early Qing. This tradition even continues in contemporary Chinese literature, such as in the fiction by Mo Yan, a recent Nobel laureate in literature, as we all know. Then I think I will, how we do? Close? Well, okay. Let me point out, again, so he's got a few particular remarks about specific passages, but says that your discussion of the motif illusion and earthliness is very well written and can fully support your major arguments. This is the tracing of the oldest extant Du Zi Qun in Chinese to a Sanskrit collection that you talked about in your presentation also. Then he concludes with the comment that in the 20th century, in a decade and a half into this century, Chinese scholars have written hundreds of papers and scores of books on strange and fantastic tales in China and their relations with Indian literature, and with Jataka tales and with Buddhist sutras in particular. The origins of nearly all of these Chinese tales have been traced to India. A lot of comparative research work has been done very well. Lu Xun, in his brief history of Chinese fiction, is still of great guiding significance. Then he lists a few May 4th intellectuals in the early 20th century who have all made valuable contributions to the area of China-India comparative literature. Nevertheless, almost all of their writings are in Chinese. I find that Dr. Chanda has not used any materials from these scholars. You know what's coming next. The Chinese language may be a barrier, but it can also serve as a useful vehicle. If you want to continue your studies in this area, it's preferable to know and read Chinese literature, which you're doing, right? Yeah, of course. In the original, and he says this is a treasure house beyond imagination. I really appreciate the paper by Dr. Chanda for her profound exploration and excellent work on such an involved subject. Ooh. Okay. Okay, so we have about 30 minutes. We have 30 minutes until break, 45 until the next session. So shall we have the paper presenters?
Yeah.
Go? Okay. So we'll go in the order. Joe, go first, please.
Stranger, fantastic.
I'd like to thank Professor Liu in absentia for the very kind comments that he provided. As for some of the major points relating to the paper that have been raised, what's new about the paper? So basically, based on a survey of literature dealing with the India-China boundary dispute, comprehensively covering most of the major historians who have done creditable work, this study uses, unlike all of those studies, Chinese cartographic evidence, which has not been published up until now, in order to show that even a claim of a consistent, unique, fixed, traditional, customary boundary that the Chinese make unto this day stands on its head when you use Chinese cartographic sources themselves. So if one looks at contemporary articulation on this by the Chinese ambassador who claimed all of Arunachal Pradesh belongs to China, well, it stands on its head if you look at some of the maps and the depiction of those areas, and even using cartographic evidence by expeditionary travelers. Again, the point that is usually raised, this distinction that you tried to make on, Yang Lu tried to make on the boundary making exercise being imperial in the eastern sector, but neatly falling into the traditional customary boundary category in the western sector. Again, I think this study sort of punctures the Chinese argument that the McMahon line was a purely imperial exercise, because going through the archival diplomatic correspondence, there is evidence which I have cited very clearly on how the Chinese authorized Chen Yifan to participate in the Shimla conference. I have quoted line and phrase on how the territorial limits of Tibet were authorized to be discussed in the conference. And at the same time, in order to maintain, as in all honesty, all objectivity, I also highlighted how, according to the sequence of how the Simla conference progressed, there was clearly a certain diplomatic slate of hand which was played out in the month of March 1914, which gave birth to the McMahon line even before the tripartite conference could arrive at some sort of a consensus on what the content of the convention should be. So clearly, what's new about the study is that the Chinese reliance on the imperial nature of the delimitation of the eastern sector, as that being McMahon line being an imperial exercise, that also cannot be taken at its face value once you go through fresh evidence that I presented. I also tried to show that including the cartographic evidence relating to how that area was delimited on the map, by showing that the objection which was raised by Sun Bao-che, the minister in the Chinese Foreign Office, related to the Chinese-Tibetan frontier, and at no point, despite having handled the maps myself, at no point were there questions raised on the southern delimitation of Tibet's frontiers. That also brings to light a new perspective on how China today claims this to be an imperial exercise, but that was not how things stood even in 1914. And I've also adduced a lot of evidence to show that the Chinese were willing to actually continue with British mediation. I've quoted again para and verse on how the Chinese Foreign Office wanted the British to continue mediating on this tripartite exercise subsequent to the Shimla conference to arrive at some sort of an agreement. So therefore, I don't think that reliance any further on simply bracketing the eastern sector as an imperial exercise and the western one as some sort of a traditional customary boundary line itself, I don't think evidence actually corroborates that sort of a claim. Even in the eastern sector, the expeditionary travelers, their accounts, that of other historians relating to the Abors, the Miris, the Mishmis, the Daflas, and the other tribes, and the fact that they owed allegiance to the British government actually also punctures the current argument that the Chinese boundary line should actually lie up until the Assam plains. So that argument also gets punctured. If you look at the bulk of the literature on India-China boundary making, what they have done is to show that Indian maps have changed over time. So they would show Indian maps, bulk of these historians would show Indian maps at the time of independence showing the Kashmir boundary to be undemarcated. It was printed, they would use a different color shade, but it was printed undemarcated. And then they would go on to show that after 1954, well, Nehru unilaterally decided to change the map, and then he made it into a dotted line, which shows that there was some sort of a boundary that was unmutable. That's the evidence that historians use, but I tried to use Chinese cartographic evidence to show that, well, on both sides, it was pretty much mutable. As far as the second part of the series of questions was why in the western sector they would move further westwards. To my mind, this is a classical maximalist bargaining tactic. You basically move further westwards, your ultimate claim line, in order to begin negotiations, so that even if you recede, you land up somewhere where you know really your administrative claims lay. Why would they have done it using a further westward notation of the boundary line in the west? I assume it has to do with the fact that the McMahon line gets modified by India, and my paper also brings that out, that even the original McMahon line eventually gets slightly pushed northwards. So I assume that might be one of the reasons. So yes, that probably addresses the substantive portions relating to Yang Lu's comments. As for the sources, why it has not been italicized, well, I will italicize the sources, but as long as you can see the sources, I think that serves the purpose. Partha sir's questions on why they would be holding the current positions which are irreconcilable. I assume it has to do with the fact that New India, 1947, in a post-colonial setting, and New China, arising out of the communist movement, the fact that they were faced with the proposition of getting into war and exclusive territorial jurisdiction in a post-colonial context being challenged for the first time might have resulted in the sort of intractability that eventually came about. I've tried to highlight that Nehru has been sinned against and sinning in many ways, because he did not hold such an intractable, difficult position, but eventually, I assume it has to do with this. But the purpose of my paper was to highlight that the political importance of the claims which India and China adduce towards their boundary does not lie in it being true or in it being real, but with the fact that there was a process of political selection which led over time in the evolution of an understanding that sort of valorizes the boundary today for national pride for some strange reason, as it does. Again, some of the references which Professor Liu provided, I'll be happy to follow up with those references, but more than looking at commentaries of authors, I tried to look at primary data as it existed. So I would be happy to look at the other interpretation that Chinese authors have to offer. And I forget the point you mentioned about Tawang specifically. If you could just briefly let me know, I just rebut that.
Basically what he said was, way you present your paper, it looks as if that in the Western sector, the Indian claims have sort of closer to what the stated official positions are. Whereas in the Eastern sector, the Chinese claims are perhaps more closer to their stated official position. It's, for example, Taiwan being part of Tibet and not part of Asian claims. But while that is quote unquote, let's say, for the sake of argument, that is the true story, the on the ground actual holdings is exactly the opposite. In the Western sector, China controls territory. The Eastern sector, India controls territory. So your territorial control and your true borders are mirror images of each other. And what implication that has for dispute resolution, bargaining, etc., might be something to, but that is not the, but you don't have to respond to that because I think we have to.
Yeah, we've got 10 minutes. All right, so John, would you like to comment? Do you have a mic?
Now she does.
Now she does.
Thanks a lot to the three of my discussants. About the first question of Rebecca, concerning the English translation of Chinese materials, I mean, I'm thinking of the philological method, that is to collect as much editions on manuscripts as possible, and the collation is most of the times is to keep the original language. But as I translated the Sanskrit into English, so I think it's it is important to translate the Chinese, the different Chinese editions into English. So I think I'll do that later. And next question about the consider the difference between the Sanskrit originals and the Chinese versions. And this Sanskrit edition it had only 3 editions of the Sanskrit version, but other Buddhist text has the Bali version of the 32 Mahapuruša Rakshana and 18 Nuviyadina Rakshanas, but they don't have the Sanskrit manuscript. So maybe I can add that materials to see whether they have the annual part of like the Mahapuruša 22, these things. So maybe I'll add the Bali version to see. And about to expanding on part 4, I'm thinking about it. Yes, I agree with that. I'm thinking a lot of the other meanings, so I'm thinking of expanding it. There's so many questions. About the question of Bassan, the first one is the methodological innovation. I've read in the page 2 of my article, I said a philological method includes the research of the original text, the translational versions and new translations and annotations, and collation of different versions, etc. And the method of culture study could be roughly divided into the influence study and parallel comparison. So I don't think whether it will answer your question because there's so many details of how to do this culturology things. And the next question is about universality. Said evidence. I'm thinking of this universality is kind of feeling. I mean, the Buddha is related to animals, so I'm thinking of the Jesus Christ. You know, Jesus Christ is the white people, right? But Buddha is not white and not black and not yellow. The skin of the Buddha is golden, so it doesn't belong to any race. So I think, and all the elements that relate to the auspicious animals is not. I mean, the relationship between the Buddha and every race, every human being's race is equal. I mean, Buddha is not inclined to any part of the people. It's equal to everyone. That's what I'm thinking of this universality. I don't think whether I explain myself right or so. That's my thinking. And about the Pu and Fang, Pu Yao Jing and Fang Guang Da Zhuan Jing, the details of that, I think I contained everything in the 30 pages of the collection, because every detail, like you could see in the page 8 of my article is Mahapurusha, 23rd Mahapurusha Rakshanas. You could see the English translation of Sanskrit is the genitals are hidden inside the body, so there's no mentioning of the horse. But the Fang Guang Da Zhuan Jing also said the genitals are hidden. There's no mentioning of the horse. But Fo Ben Xing Ji Jing said is similar to the horse, and Pu Yao Jing also said is similar to the horse in Chinese. So it's different. I mean, the Fang Guang Da Zhuan Jing is translated directly from the Sanskrit version, but the other two, they had different manuscripts. So you can see every one is different. That's why I keep all this 30 pages here. But I mean, the philological way is to put different versions together and to mark every detailed differences of it, so that other people, I mean, not all of the 32 Mahapurushas and 80 Anuvidyanas are related to the animal things. I only pick out what I need, but other people can use my collation to pick out what they need. That's why I put everything there. What? Oh, about the Jeffers question. Yeah, the first two are great point about the religious person transformed into a new one. That's wonderful. I'll think about it. And you said my claim is to challenge the God system. I didn't say that. I said it's to challenge the human being system. So maybe you misunderstand me. Oh, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks all.
Now, Barnali. There are plenty up here. There are 4 up here.
Okay, thank you so much for all the comments, because I believe that they will really, all these comments will help me to build on this proper, like the paper would be much more, I think it would, in a very constructive way, it can contribute something. So the first, Dr. Kaneti, so the concept of strange and genre, the difference as you mentioned, the genre I did not mention here because maybe somewhere the numbers, like the word count was really like was becoming an issue for me. So the genres which I used were Chuanqi and Triquai, and I used them together. I mean, I did not really categorize those, I mean, those stories, you know, but the Taiping Guangqi I used in the stories where there were Triquai, there were Chuanqi, there were some other genres also. I did not categorize because it would take some more, but in my dissertation I am using all those categories. So maybe, but I should maybe touch upon that point, definitely. Then as Professor Jian Liu also said, and you also said that the function, whether the resistance or the another, like whether it was really a resistance from below, like the popular fiction, and can it be considered as a resistance to the Confucian doctrines? It's a, I mean, I know my paper maybe portrays it like that, but maybe I can like sort of, I remember my discipline, comparative literature, where it's always like sometimes it is like this canon and periphery, marginalized and, you know, center, and so this kind of argument, that's why it maybe came up. But yeah, definitely there was no resistance at that time. That was not the time for political resistance, but definitely, yeah, this. As Professor Jian Liu said that, yeah, I understand that translation, because he said that Confucius's he did not use the term strange, he used the term other doctrines. So there I understand why it is like other doctrines, because it's not history. So something other than history is other doctrines. It's called other doctrines. So that other and self, that kind of a division comes here, and that's why maybe that resistance issue also comes. But definitely there was no specific resistance at that time. Maybe I can like maybe reorganize that section a bit. Yeah, definitely I can. And the texts of the story is not possible to give, because I have translated about 20 stories, and here I think I have described about like maybe 10 stories. So that can go as an appendix to some, maybe for the paper, but not really. But as you said, maybe some quotations and all I can give. Yeah, true. And until today, how is it relevant now? It's still very relevant, as already Professor Jian Liu said, that this Mo Yan's writings and all, strange is very relevant, and all the time it's relevant. It will remain relevant because it has imagination as its element in that. So that's, I hope I have addressed most of the issues that you raised. And then for Dr. Pesang, thank you so much for your comments. So why I chose this comparison, like the fantastic and strange, why I brought up this. As I said, that this element of imagination in the stories and all, it always had fascinated me always, because this is something where you have that liberation. I have talked about the liberation of, which has like in Lotus Sutra also we find this concept of liberation in the doctrine, or so that story. In these stories we find this kind of a liberation where you have a very like mundane life, and from that you from that you really take some leave and think, and so that space for imagination is what this strange stories they always encourage. So that's why I have chose this kind of, and then Indian and Chinese stories parallelly, it's fascinating to look at. For me it was like that. And methodology was mostly I use thematology in, as you say, that in my discipline, comparative literature, thematology and thematology is a very prominent kind of a methodology for comparative literature. So I have used thematology. So I used, so that's why I was talking about motifs and themes. So this two particularly I took for this, and I really did not look at the formal, like the the genealogy part of these stories, which I might look, but in my dissertation I am doing that also. I really agree a lot with this third narrative world. It is actually, that is a completely separate, in my dissertation it's a completely separate chapter on this. So it's a long, that is a really long section. I thought just to touch upon that for some reason, and but if it is really like it's abrupt maybe, but maybe we can discuss that later. But this it is a third narrative world. It's not really a first or second narrative. So how the third narrative world comes up, we can talk about that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, we have a few minutes for a discussion. Who would like to say remarks on the papers or the comments? Who maybe hasn't had a chance yet? Okay. Does anybody who's okay?
Okay. Since I was able to read both of your papers, I think the two of you have so many things in common. But looking at it from different sides, but the ways you're approaching the materials, I think, is so similar. And so I would actually encourage the two of you to meet and discuss.
Thank you very much. I mean, when I see her, your topic, I mean, your emphasis on the strangeness of the themes or motifs in literary works, and the auspicious animals of the Buddha is also a strange kind of strangeness. So it's so maybe we'll discuss more.
And plus the point that Buddhism is the reason, at least he's saying, Buddhism is the reason why Chinese literature has this fantastic and strange tradition, and you're, of course, looking at the Buddhist auspicious animals. Yeah. Okay, I saw Yang's hand and then Marina. Did you have?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just some comments on the reaction of Joe to my comments. And I would like to say that because you talk about, I say that in the Western sectors, Chinese approach is more towards arguments imperial boundaries, and I disagree with you. This is that because you claim that both countries claim as traditional customary boundaries. So here in the Eastern sector, your comparisons in the Eastern sectors, your sources is mainly so in for the 1913s, 14th similar conferences, and here. But the things that we discussed, so your claim that or the subject or subjects of your how to say. Your starting point is traditional customary boundary, and it's the problem is that the time, and because you focus mainly on the 1930s and 1940s, but then it's this imperial so imposed imperial boundary is more a discourse after the or after the in the 1950s and 60s. So this is something that I just want to to point out that, and so that the period we talk about is different. You are talking about the CMR conference, and what I talked about is narrative. So 50s and 60s. And another thing is here you are the evolution of boundary makings. There's lots of resources you can use from the Indian perceptions, and it's interesting to see to go more in the Chinese part, decision-making part, and. In any way, you are doing an amazing job because you shows lots of so cartographs from the Chinese side, and it's very difficult to collect all this informations. But so the more detailed to go into the Chinese sources and not to assume why China choose that will be make your arguments more strong. Okay, stronger. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Marina?
I have comments for both Joe and Yuan Zhang. For Joe, it's really a comment rather than a question for something that you can expand on in some future research. When you were describing the border issues, China, India, and all sorts of other contested territories, I couldn't help but think about the Balkan Peninsula and the restructuring of borders following the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So because towards the end of your paper you have a little kind of one sentence about China being not a nation state but an empire, perhaps it might be interesting to look at how empires are restructured into nation states and how borders are contested in this process of restructuring, and examine whether this construction of borders kind of play out in a similar way. And this might be able to bring you closer to the question that Partha raised, which is what sustains certain narratives. Why is the border in this part of the world still contested? Well, maybe you can say even on the Balkan Peninsula is still contested because one of the newest countries there, Macedonia, only started existing in 1992, right? So contestation of borders from nation state to empire might be of interest. And my comment to Yuan Zhang is kind of, I really liked that you brought in an image. Obviously, I like images. But you don't seem to reference images so much in your work. You go with textual rather than visual. So would you say you brought in the image to sort of maybe confirm that the the images are also expressive of the textual reference. But is that really true? Is it that images always follow these representations of different... You're smiling too much. But anyway, so how do images relate to these textual references? Are they the same, different, surprising, if you are using images also in your work?
Okay. Nimi, please. Pass the mic down to Nimi.
Joe, I'm here. You mentioned the British surveys were done without China's participation. So I'm wondering that the reason for, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason why these surveys had to be done clandestinely was because it coincided with the period of the century of isolation that the Qings had imposed on Tibet following their administrative reforms of 1793? Did it coincide with that? So you had essentially three challenges facing the British expeditionary cartographers or whatever. One was the forbidding terrain. Two was the fact that you had to do this, mount this without Chinese participation, and three, it had to be clandestine. So, given these three constraints, how was the data collected? It must have been a huge. I mean, we know we get a sense of this through accounts of Nansing and Rawat, and which come to us in belatedly acknowledging the role that pundits and these explorers, the part that they played in collecting. And some of the snippets are really fascinating about data being collected in prayer wheels and passed on. So could you just give us a sense of that? Thank you.
Okay, I think we are officially concluded. These conversations and dialogues can, of course, continue well into into the next session, or even into dinner and into the evening. I want to give everyone who commented, including Professor Liu Jian, a very warm hand. Thanks.